I debated with myself about whether or not to do a Christmas-themed video this year, 2021. I said to myself, well, last year I did that whole series on the virgin birth, and it was really on the infancy narratives about Jesus and even his genealogies and so forth. And I'm going to include a link to that in the show notes down below. And so I thought to myself, well, that material's all out there. Do I really need to do a Christmas video this year? But as I thought about it, I thought, well, yeah, probably should do something specifically about the Christmas season that is released on that Sunday, that fourth Sunday in Advent, just before Christmas. So this is it. I decided to connect Christmas with another theme that is interesting to me, which is the theme of additional motives for authors to include things beyond the mere fact that the statement is true. Now, I'm really concerned about our admitting these additional motives unnecessarily, and that's part of why I've called this video, Is Truth Enough? It's a delicate matter. Obviously, the authors could not tell everything that they knew, everything that happened about Jesus. The Gospel of John specifically says that the world could not contain the books that would be written if everything were included. But at the same time, we often don't know of any other motive, and sometimes things are just random. This is a phrase that I have often used, the randomness of saliency. Saliency is when something stands out to you. So, for example, when Mark mentions that they sat down on the green grass, and this is especially true with small details, that just stood out to Peter. It's going to be extremely subjective and I believe unjustified for us to be trying to come up with some specific motive other than the fact that the grass was green for Mark to record that. So I think we need to be willing to just say, yeah, they said that because it was true. Interestingly, you do find even legitimately, genuinely conservative scholars who don't always realize exactly how they're maybe unintentionally, and I think if they're genuinely conservative, it is unintentionally, casting doubt upon the truth of something by sort of dragging in some other motive. So here's an example. I was reading a book, and I don't even remember who wrote it, and I've deliberately not looked it up. And he was talking about the dating of the Gospels, and he conjectured that the Gospel of Matthew was written after a date when some specific false teachers, and he had, I believe, a specific heresy in mind, had come into the church. And so he was sort of looking for things in the life situation of Matthew's audience. And he said, and he just says it, that this was written after these false teachers had come into the church. And then he included references in parentheses to Matthew. And you go look up those references, and it's just Jesus predicting that false teachers will come. Now, that's kind of a timeless prediction. I mean, we have false teachers now, 2,000 years later, and Jesus doesn't say, like any specific thing about what they're teaching that corresponds to that particular heresy that the scholar had in mind. So it's really odd. And if Jesus really predicted this, and Matthew was recording what Jesus said on a particular occasion, which he appears to be doing, then why should we think that Matthew is recording this because of some particular false teaching, some particular heresy he has in mind at the time? So that whole enterprise of trying to use the teachings of Jesus in a gospel as a clue to when the gospel is written seems to me to be dubious. And it's dubious partly because if they're recording a discourse on a particular occasion and they remember, or they have a source that remembers that Jesus did teach in this way on that occasion, then I don't think we need to look farther and say, well, it's being put in there as this really sort of subtle allusion to the life situation of the audience. Now, what does all that have to do with Christmas, you might ask? Well, I think we have an even more glaring instance where truth is easily enough for recording something in the case of the infancy narratives about Jesus and also his genealogies. A Jewish audience would have been very interested in the genealogy of Jesus, his claim to be the Messiah, and they would have been teaching Gentiles as well that he was the Messiah and that depended on his descent. So the genealogies would certainly have been of interest. So imagine Matthew and Luke, and they believe that they really have this information. Imagine it vividly. Try to get it really vivid into your mind, where they've talked to people, like maybe Matthew has talked to James. I don't know whether it was James, but some member of Jesus' family. And maybe Luke has talked to Mary or some member of Mary's family. Luke's perspective seems to be sort of Marian. It's from Mary's perspective. And you've got these stories about, wise men and shepherds and angels and prophecies of the birth of John the Baptist in the case of Luke, and then the birth of Jesus, dreams people are having, the Magi and the flight to Egypt and all of that. That material is remarkable. It's easily interesting enough that you can well imagine the authors wanting to include it. As you know, if you've seen my video on the synoptic problem, I think it's plausible that Matthew wrote a shorter version of his gospel earlier in Hebrew or in Aramaic, and that did not, if it existed, I think did not include this infancy story. But when he's writing his longer gospel, if he's collected this material in the meanwhile, you can well imagine it saying, oh, Mark doesn't seem to have heard about that. Well, I'll be sure to include it, and tell about it. And the same way with Luke, he's got yet more material that he would want to include that. So why am I saying all this? Why am I emphasizing that truth is easily enough in the case of the Gospels? Well, this relates to the issue of the Gospel genre. If you follow my work, you know that I question the idea that the Gospels are in such a specific thing as Greco-Roman biography. And sometimes the phrase ancient biography will be used, which sounds just general. They're ancient and they're about someone's life, and it really means this specific thing, that they're in this literary genre. Now, of all of the gospel authors, Luke is the one who would be most likely to have actually maybe read some lives, as they were called, like Plutarch or whatever. We don't know that, but his Greek is the highest Greek in the Gospels. And so he may have had a Greek education to some degree. So he might have recognized some general similarity there. But I argued also in The Mirror or the Mask, by the way, that merely resembling Greco-Roman biography or even being in Greco-Roman biography did not make it part and parcel of that genre to embellish, to invent, to add things that you didn't have reason to believe really happened. So read The Mirror or the Mask for more on that. The question is, what was the motive of Matthew and Luke in including these stories about Jesus' birth? That is related to genre in the following way. Richard Burridge is the classicist who has most popularized this Greco-Roman biography thesis. And he kind of knows that he needs to argue for it, but he doesn't argue enough for it. And so, interestingly, a lot of people don't know this, in the case of Mark, Richard Burridge admits and says Mark might have just sort of fallen accidentally into resembling Greco-Roman biography. Well, in that case, what does it even mean to say it's in that genre? Remember, if we're going to use this to say something about conventions, then the author has to at least be acquainted with those conventions and with that literary tradition that he's supposedly writing. And if it's just an accidental resemblance, that's kind of a meaningless thesis from any contentful perspective about what we should expect to find, good or bad, if it's just an accidental resemblance. So when he gets to Matthew and Luke, Burridge says they were consciously trying to bring their documents into alignment with the conventions of Greco-Roman biography. what is his reason for this? What is his evidence for this? Well, they're in better Greek. I mean, that's a terrible argument. Maybe they just wrote better Greek than Mark. And then he says, well, they include infancy narratives and stories like Luke has the story of Jesus in the temple as a boy, and genealogies. And that would have been in line with the conventions of Greco-Roman biography. So there's his evidence that they read Mark, and then they're like trying to use Mark and kind of add to Mark to bring it more in line with the conventions of Greco-Roman biography. Now, Burrage doesn't say whether he thinks these infancy and boyhood stories are true. What am I going to say about that? Well, Richard Burrage, I don't think has any desire to claim the conservative scholarly label for himself. In fact, in one place I remember he kind of sort of mocks at the notion of distinguishing conservatism and liberalism in scholarship. Anytime you see somebody doing that, he's probably a liberal. So he doesn't say one way or another if he thinks these stories really happened. It does not seem to me implausible that he thinks that they either didn't or that they were embellished to a significant extent, but he just doesn't say. But I think it should strike you as odd to say Matthew and Luke included these amazing stories in their documents to bring them in line with the conventions of this literary genre. They had this literary motive. If you think it really happened, I don't think we should just be sort of accepting that without stopping. We should pause. Don't just say, oh, well, maybe they did that. That doesn't necessarily mean it isn't true. Just pause. Just stop a moment. Try to imagine vividly, as I just did a little while ago, Matthew and Luke talking to people who actually were in a position to know that these things were true, told them these things were true. They know that these stories have not been published before in a written form. And try to imagine what's in their minds. Do they need to be saying to themselves, oh, I want to be more in line with Greco-Roman biography than Mark was, so I better include this. I wasn't gonna include it. All that stuff about the wise men and Joseph's dreams and the flight to Egypt, or in Luke's case, all of that about the angel that came to Mary and the birth of John the Baptist. I wasn't gonna include it, or I wasn't sure whether to include it or not, but come to think of it, that would really help to further this literary goal of making my document more like a Greco-Roman biography. Is that plausible? I don't think that's plausible. I think that once we stop to really ask ourselves what it is we're conjecturing, we should recognize that truth is enough. And that this literary motive is just a kind of fifth wheel. It's just a tag-along to even theorize it. And therefore, it cannot act as a data point. Like, okay, here's this data point. Matthew and Luke are bringing their documents more into line with the genre of Greco-Roman biography. Like Jews wouldn't be interested in this too. And Matthew is a very Jewish gospel. Like anybody wouldn't be interested in it. Most of us are very interested in these stories, even if we've never read a Greco-Roman biography in our entire lives, okay? So it's that theory cannot act as a data point from which we then further argue, so we see that these are really Greco-Roman biography. No, we really don't see that at all. We don't see that at all. My willingness to say that perhaps Luke was acquainted with Greco-Roman biography is entirely based on other considerations of like Luke's own abilities and the reasons for thinking he may have been a Gentile and so forth, and that he was a doctor, if he was a doctor. It's not based on, the inclusion of the infancy narratives, and it's just a theory that he may have been acquainted with them, not that he's trying self-consciously to make his document conform in some way. He's writing, as Colin Hemer said, something that would have been seen as very unusual Greco-Roman biography, if indeed it is a bios. And Hemer has an excellent discussion of this, and I'll link a blog post I did on that also in the show notes below. So I think we need to get our ideas of truth very vivid. And once our ideas of truth are vivid, then we're not going to be reaching or accepting unthinkingly these additional motives that don't really have independent evidence going for them. So if John reports that there were 153 fish, we know that fishermen do count their fish. We're not going to be quick to say, 153, it's a triangular number. Maybe this had this symbolic meaning. It's just there were 153 fish. Okay? Now, it's a delicate thing, as I said, because you're not going to record every little thing. But unless the author tells us his motive, like this was done to fulfill prophecy, which they do sometimes do, but unless there's some other statement to that effect, it's all going to be, way out there, like being 153 fish and 153 being a triangular number. Or as I've seen someone conjecture about the green grass, he makes me to lie down in green pastures. We have no evidence that Mark was trying to allude to that. Mark, as a narrator, if we take it that Jesus was really bringing this about and this really happened. Okay, so I think we need to pause, and all the more so in the case of the infancy stories, all the more so because they are so obviously fascinating and exciting and interesting and important. Of course, skeptics have objections to them, and that's why I did the series of videos on their truth last year, answering objections to them. And I'm planning, this will happen between my recording this and its appearing, I'm planning to be on a live stream in a couple of days on the infancy stories. And if I get a chance to include that link in the show notes, I'll try to remember to do that as well. I can always update it and include that later, answering objections to them. I'm not going to do that here. Here, what I'm just trying to point out is that when you hear somebody say, they included the infancy stories in order to fulfill the genre considerations of Greco-Roman biography, you should say, why do I need that? Why do I need that? Or even, Luke has Jesus born in Bethlehem to fulfill Micah 5:2. Luke doesn't mention Micah. He doesn't mention that prophecy at all. Matthew mentions certain prophecies in connection with Jesus, that it might be fulfilled and so forth. But Luke doesn't mention any prophecy in connection with Jesus' birth, and certainly not in connection with the place of Jesus' birth. For all we know, Luke might not even have known about the alleged prediction that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. He may not even have been aware of that. So we need to be slow to assume that somebody had another motive in addition to truth. And in consideration of the Christmas season, I also want to say truth is enough in another sense. The truth is enough to sustain you, whatever you're going through right now. And especially since we have such a glorious truth that God came down to earth and was incarnate and was born of the Virgin Mary and was made man. That truth is enough as well in that sense. The light shineth in darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Thanks be to God, and Merry Christmas.